In 1960, when most African countries attained independence, America had a privileged position in the minds of each African nation. Having a central role in every major international organization, especially the part the United States played at the United Nations to end colonization, every African nation looked up to her. At that time, President Kennedy understood the importance of Africa as a source of raw material to boost its economy, which has positioned her as a world leader. These objectives and views were echoed in the following paraphrased welcome address to the maiden visit of one of the world's youngest presidents, Amadou Ahidjo of Cameroon. Your visit is an opportunity to learn more about your country and people and the possibilities and problems of Africa that loom so loud on the world scene. In my opinion, this is the most fortunate time for you to visit us. Your country is the hinge geographically upon which most of Africa turns. And I believe it can be the hinge upon which most Africa can turn politically and economically. The indication is that President Kennedy had a clear vision for the new Africa from the clutches of colonization. However, it's alleged once the president of Cameroon, Amadou Ahidjo, left Washington, D.C., General de Gaulle of France had a conversation with President Kennedy, reminding him of the importance of preserving the French interest and influence in Africa, otherwise known as France-Afrique. As evidence points out today, France had signed secret accords with her colonies before the United Nations granted them independence. President Kennedy's unfortunate and untimely passing worsened matters as the U.S. turned its back on Africa, favoring President Richard Nixon's ping-pong diplomacy. At that time, the Chinese economy was no better than most African countries that had achieved independence. The outcome of that alliance can be argued to give China the edge it has today in both political and economic domains. Thus, China has comfortably become a primary U.S. challenger and rival and has an edge over Africa. I guess the United States and her Western allies never saw this coming. Africans are not blind not to being able to determine who means well for them and who doesn't. What the United States should have been doing in Africa in the 60s is what China is doing. On the contrary, the US bought into the Europeans' duplicity of seeing the welcoming African attitude as a sign of foolishness and weakness. After all, if they could enslave and colonize Africa, they could keep them in perpetual poverty, make them dependent, discourage development, and withhold information technology for Africans to remain subservient. Anytime a man pulls a stunt against an opponent, they forget their opponent becomes wiser. Amid the political and economic turmoil in Africa generating a lot of controversies due to the Western powers' exploitative disregard of the African continent and the emergence of BRICS as a new economic bloc, does the United States still stand a chance in Africa? The answer to those questions would receive a resounding yes for 3 reasons. The U.S. is host to millions of first- and second-generation Africans. The U.S. has the highest concentration of blacks and African Americans whose roles and relationships matter to the African continent. Anything that affects African Americans in the United States directly affects Africans. Lastly, as a world power, the U.S. still has a relative advantage over China and Russia. It's time to use that advantage to right the wrongs it made in Africa rather than trying to act as a bully and teacher. There's nothing new Africans need to know about political democracy and human behavior. Let the U.S. look at the recent European economy and immigration policies. The wind has blown, and everyone can see the hens cloaca and the adverse effects their discriminatory policies have produced. Africa needs to tighten its screws, and the entire European continent will be in hot waters.